Welcome to the 21.5 Show, a podcast for professional pilots by professional pilots. I'm Dylan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host Max. We're both professional pilots with experience in flight instruction, airlines, and business aviation.
In this episode, I'll give an update on my new hire training. We'll talk to an international trip planning service about what's going on in Iran and Cuba. And then Jim Deuvall, an aircraft performance expert, joins us to discuss takeoff performance. And of course, we'll top it off with one of our favorite stories from the road.
You're on 121.5, the emergency frequency.
Hey guys, welcome back. It's time for another episode of the 21.5 Show. Max is still joining me remotely out at New Hire Training. Max, how's it going out there?
New hire training is good. It's arduous. I can't believe I've only been here a few weeks and I still have many weeks to go, but it's good. We're learning a lot. You know, it's a different program from where I came from. Like I said last time, it was a lot of company stuff, and then all of a sudden you just hit the systems of the airplane hard and fast. And it was a different way to be taught systems. It wasn't, death by PowerPoint where you sit there in a class and do all you can to stay awake till the next break. The systems were taught. You kind of did a brief. You had a group of four people and an instructor, and you go into a room, you kind of have a brief, an overview of what you're doing, talk a little bit about the systems, but then you'd get into a trainer, which is, a mock-up of the cockpit on big touch screen. So you touch the switches and the buttons and everything works, but it's just touch screens. And then there's another monitor on either side that will show a schematic of the hydraulic system or the electrical system or whatever. So when you flip a switch or hit a button, you can see when you manipulate it what happens in the system, what pumps turn on, what buses are energized, that kind of thing. And it was actually a really good way to learn the systems, opposed to learning it in PowerPoint and understanding it and then taking it to the cockpit and trying to understand what's going on. You kind of brought those two together all at once, and it was a good way to learn the systems. I thought, and on top of that, you kind of did your flows and things like that, and you saw what happened in the system as you manipulated it through the course of normal operation, which is, practical knowledge. So it was a really interesting thing. But the thing is, you have 4 days of systems, you study for a few days, and then you have your type oral.
Wow, that's fast.
Yeah, and everyone kind of freaks out, but it's, trust the program, blah, blah, blah. And they're right. You go through it, you have your four guys, and then every day you sit down. And the way the oral's presented here is you get up in front of a big blown up panel on the wall and you teach it. And my oral, literally, the guy asked me no questions, 0 questions. You get up there and you go through each switch and button on the panel and you tell how it works, and you kind of throw in the limitations and any memory items associated with a failure of that system. And you go through it piece by piece by piece. And, I talked for an hour and 45 minutes. The funny thing about it, I think, is that if you're not good at standing in front of somebody and presenting, then that puts you at a disadvantage for this oral, which isn't necessarily a skill that's pertinent to flying the airplane. But people like that just can't do it, they'll sit down and they'll just ask you questions because, you can't fail an oral because you can't present. That's not in the...
Yeah, that's in 61-209, I think.
Public speaking. That's why we took that class at Embry-Riddle.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, you go through, you talk about it, you explain what happens and what each button and switch does, which is the practical end of it. And there's some deeper system knowledge that's required beyond just that, but that's how it went. So that was done. Then I had 2 days off. And you have to do observations in the jump seat. So I went home and came back for a couple days and got 2 observations knocked out, and then we're here, and now we started into some payroll. People came, crew scheduling came and talked to us, and then we kind of start going into the automation side of VNAV, auto throttles, if people haven't done that stuff, and kind of leading up now. You're preparing for the sim, but before you get there, you're still in the IPT or VPT or CPT. They have all different types of trainers and stuff that you go through, and you better know how to get the thing started and push and ready to go in a predetermined amount of time before you even get in the simulator, or it's not going to go well. So that's kind of where we're at now.
It's like they said they squeeze 2 weeks of training into 2 months, right?
Well, they do, but then there's times when it's very intense, and I think it kind of builds until this oral that everyone's stressed out about. Then it's over that, and now we're kind of sitting through listening to this, that. We went on a field trip to the the operations center, and you kind of walk around, do some other stuff, and then it starts to intensify again through the automation. And depending on what you came from, if you've never used VNav and auto throttles and all this other stuff, then it's more complicated. And if you have, then it's an easier transition. It just depends on what you're coming from and how stressful that is. And then it starts to build towards getting ready for the world or for the simulator, and make sure you're prepared to even get in the sim, because the sims are apparently pretty fast paced. I don't know. I'll let you know.
So I remember from my experience going through an initial training or new hire training, it's 6, 7, 8 weeks long. It's a marathon, not a sprint, right? And I think that is one of the most important things for guys going into it that have maybe never done that before, is pacing yourself. You can really get wrapped around the axle studying for an oral or focusing on one specific thing, but it is a test of endurance, mental endurance, I think, in a way.
Well, the other thing too is you have to figure out how to hold it together, because you can't sit here and go 6 days on, 1 day off for an extended period of time and not do stuff outside of this. Fortunately, the hotel, it's the summertime. It's got a great pool and this whole setup. So we go to the pool and we hang out, and we kind of decompress there, and bring your iPad there, which is your EFB, and you can study at the pool and some of that stuff. But you have to figure out a balance, because some of these guys, like, we don't see. And I'll tell you what, it seemed like there was a correlation between people that are at the pool having a good time and those that are moving through the training and doing well and performing well, and those that you never see and lock themselves in the room and not interacting so much with the other classmates are the ones that seem to struggle. So I don't know if that's, there's been any study on that, but that's sure the way it seems.
Yeah, we're going to send our news team down to review that, and we'll have an in-depth analysis on the perfect amount of
very warranted
pool time. Yeah.
But it is. It's like you said, a marathon, not a sprint. It just, some days it seems like Groundhog's Day, but overall, everyone's good guys. We laugh a lot. We have a good time. We try and keep it light and, get done what needs to be done.
Well, while you're busy in the classroom, crazy stuff is happening all over the world. I'm sure most of our listeners have seen a lot of stuff in the news about what's going on overseas in Iran and even more locally. One weakness we have on this podcast is neither of us are big international operators. I almost fly exclusively domestic, and for the time being, you're going to be doing some narrow body domestic stuff. So we're not super immersed in international ops. So what we're going to be doing for the show is having a call in every once in a while with our friends over at the International Trip Planning Service, ITPS, and they've graciously provided one of their analysts to kind of give us updates whenever there's something interesting to cover. So we're going to go ahead and call ITPS right now. They're going to give us a little update on what's going on in Iran and Cuba.
You've reached International Trip Planning Services. This call will be recorded.
All right, well, on the line today, I have Phil Linebaugh from ITPS, the International Trip Planning Service that I have used in the past, and they've been a great resource for me. We just wanted to call Phil today to discuss some of the current international hot button issues. Obviously, in the news, we've seen a lot about Iran going on and some airspace restrictions there. And then also, I've been hearing some stuff about restrictions for Cuba. So, Phil, I was wondering if you might have a few minutes to talk to us about those.
Absolutely. Thank you for including us. So, right now, talking about Iran, and I'm going to have Ben Fuller, our operations manager, chime in with us as well. The tensions going on in Iran right now are pretty stiff right now. Somebody shot down a drone, not pointing any fingers, not wanting to get any political or anything, but now the fear is that a airplane could be next. We've seen it on the water. The same thing happened. Started out with little things, and then eventually grew to where somebody did shoot an airplane here years ago. So we want to make sure that everybody's up to date as to what's going on over there. We do have some airspace restrictions on that. Ben, do you have those exact restrictions?
Yeah, so fortunately, overall, we're still allowed to overfly Iranian airspace in most cases. However, the U.S. did put out a NOTAM that restricted certain overwater areas, parts of the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. So some of the flights that are heading east out of Dubai, places like Abu Dhabi, these flights heading east into the southern Iranian portions of that FIR could be affected with overflights now restricted. So it doesn't look like that's going to change anytime soon, and we'll have to keep an eye out for tensions rising. Of course, we've seen in the news in the last few days with President Trump deciding not to have a retaliatory action towards that. So that may calm it down over time, but we'll have to see what transpires.
Hey, and guys, I mean, have you had any clients? Like, I know if I was over there, if I was a PAC on an airplane, I'd probably go, I'm probably just going to avoid Iran altogether. Has that been the case with most of your clients, or are you still having people overfly Iran right now?
Over the past week, we haven't seen anybody want to overfly Iran over the past week. In the last 6 months, I'd say we've seen a drastic decline in people wanting to overfly Iran. Prior to this mess, we were having issues over Iran anyway. They would give us a permit number, and then the aircraft would get to the FIR boundary, and they would deny the aircraft and make them do a couple turns in holding, and then miraculously the permit would be found and they'd let them come across. They mess with people a lot going across there, especially in registered aircraft. We've seen a lot of people wanting to get away from it. One of the things that I've spoken about in the past at the IOCs and at schedulers conferences has been the fact that if in fact you do decide to overfly Iran, even without these sanctions and without the tensions being high the way they are right now, but if you overfly Iran and you have an issue with your aircraft and you've got to put the aircraft on the ground at the closest airport, and that closest airport happens to be in Iran, all of a sudden you're the leading story on CNN or Fox News because Iran has an unregistered aircraft. That's huge. How long is it going to take you to be able to get somebody in to fix the airplane? How long is it going to be to get your passengers out of there? Depending on who you have on board the aircraft, that could be a huge deal. The benefits of going across Iran during normal times is that, it's a lot quicker. The drawbacks are that you've got a lot of issues if you have to go in and you become a guest of the people of Iran.
Yeah, and I heard there weren't a lot of very nice Marriotts in Iran either, so that's another consideration for us pilots, right?
Yeah, they're not giving points as easily, so you're not getting your welcome gift.
Yeah, that's a major consideration. So it sounds like most people in general are just deciding just right now it's better just to steer clear, huh?
The downside far outweighs the upside on it. And now with the restrictions across there, there's some new routings to get to route around the airspace restrictions, get away from stay away from the Strait of Hormuz and the UAE Peninsula out there. Any routing across there is going to take a little bit of extra permitting, a little bit extra planning to get away from that whole airspace, and it's better safe than sorry at this point right now.
To add to Phil, we've seen so many issues in that region now, where you have restrictions in Iran, and then you have the Pakistan and Indian fights going on with the border there. So now you're getting kind of tightened, and a lot of our clients that are used to operating eastbound with the winds out of the U.S. are starting to change their mind and find different tech stops and different routings instead of going far north through Russia and down, or they're choosing some different Western European stops and then cutting south as far as they can through Saudi and Oman, and then offshore and then back into their destinations in Southeast Asia. So a lot of these flights are actually starting to take a westerly route, looking at stops even as they're more expensive through Japan and regions around there. And so that's been the trend recently.
Interesting. I didn't even think about that, but that's a really good point. Sometimes the best route isn't just the straight line, huh?
Exactly. A lot of geopolitical things to think about.
Speaking of that, I've heard some stuff going on in Cuba right now. Can you guys explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so with Cuba, they've just recently, in the first week of June, have changed their minds on Part 91 private flights in terms of we had a window there where we were able to go operate to Cuba, land, and passengers go and have a good time, and it was seeming like a pretty cool thing, a trendy thing to do for a while. But that's been shut off as of June 5th. The new rules came out that in-registered aircraft cannot operate privately to Cuba. That it did exempt air ambulances and it did exempt Charter 135. So for now, they are able to go. And this actually came down on the U.S. side. And so they made that restriction. And so unfortunately, for now and probably for the foreseeable future, we won't see any Part 91 trips to Cuba.
No Cuba, no Iran. I mean, there's just nowhere fun to go if you have a private airplane anymore.
Exactly. The party spots of the world are narrowing.
That's right.
Still overfly Cuba with no problems.
Yes.
It's the landings that are the issues.
That was my next question. Okay, good. So I know that's a big deal for a lot of U.S. operators going to the Caribbean and stuff like that.
Exactly. And like Ben said, this is coming from the U.S. side, not the Cuban side. So the Cuban permits are actually very easy to obtain. They're very quick. So any overflight, business as usual with Cubans.
Awesome. Well, guys, thank you so much for taking the time to give us a little international update today. We really appreciate it. And if our listeners want to get any more information on any of the stuff we talked about or any of the other international operations, what's the best way to get a hold of you guys?
Best way to get us would be the 866 number, 573-7067 comes right into our operations area.
Awesome. Okay, guys, we look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, Max, we read a lot of positive reviews that we got for the show on the last episode. And I was starting to get a big head and really thinking, man, we're doing some stuff. And then I remembered, you know what? You got to remember where you came from. And sometimes you just need a little straight talk. So I'm thinking we might need a little straight talk with Ted right now.
Yeah, I think you're right. We're getting all these downloads and people subscribing, this whole thing. And it's time to be grounded. Let's call Ted.
Hey,
Ted, what's up, man?
let me just give you brass tacks on your episode with the Czech airman. If I have to listen to a Czech airman talk about himself for 45 minutes, I should be getting paid like I'm at a training event. Brass tacks right there.
So you didn't enjoy it? You didn't take anything away from that?
No.
Okay. Well,
I got nothing.
We tried.
The problem is, Ted, our last episode, we had all this positive reviews we read, all this good feedback. We were getting emails from people, and we kind of just blew a little smoke up ourselves. And we needed a little straight talk from Ted to kind of remind us to get our nose back to the grindstone.
Yeah, you guys are getting carried away. It's not that good.
It's very humbling. Thank you, Ted.
Yeah.
Thanks for keeping us grounded and doing what you do.
I do want to give a big shout out to all of the listeners right now and say thank you. You know what we did today, Max? We crossed 1,500 downloads.
Whoa.
Yeah, that's awesome. We were really excited. I didn't know if anyone was going to listen to this show.
Somebody's listening, so
Somebody's listening.
we'll keep talking, I suppose.
Yeah, we'll keep talking for now.
Thanks,
Until
guys.
someone pulls the plug. Thanks, everybody.
Honestly, though, we do appreciate it. We appreciate the downloads. We appreciate the positive feedback. It means a lot. So thanks, guys.
Run, Don.
Dylan, what I think one of the most misunderstood or least understood things in aviation is takeoff performance. I think you asked 10 pilots, the climb gradient on a SID, what does that mean? Do you have to maintain that with both engines or one engine or all the time? Myself included at one point, I don't think a lot of people know the answer to those questions.
No. And then you get stuff like runway analysis, which just confuses it even more because then you're talking about like multiple things that aren't really associated.
Right. And if you run, out of Aspen, you do the LINS 8 or whatever, and the alternate procedure so you can get out of there that day. Well, how do you do that? Like, what if the engine doesn't fail right at V1 like in the simulator and it fails at 1,000 feet and you've turned left and the alternate procedure says to go right? Like, how do you do that? How do you manage that? How are you supposed to plan that? There's a lot of questions, I think, that we just kind of run the runway analysis say, oh, it looks good, let's go. But we don't really think about real life scenarios about how do you manage that?
Yeah. And I mean, it's not just for business aviation people using runway analysis. It's also for airlines too, because they do the same thing and they have alternate procedures. And it's been a question that I've always had. Oh, well, if something goes bad at V1, you do this. Oh, if nothing goes wrong, then you fly this other flight path. And if something happens after V1, well, then it's kind of a guess. And, oh, you load this in your FMS, or you load your avionics to do this, and I'll plan on this. And and the setup to try and do some of these things, it's really overwhelming. And I get why people do it. And I think under special circumstances at certain airports, maybe you operate in and out of a lot, there is value to that. But man, takeoff performance and all of those things, it's such a headache. And I just, even when I have a good instructor at the simulator school, or I listen to a good interview or a good video or something like that, I never really feel like I have a full grasp on it.
No, well, it's because it's a 1 hour segment or 30-minute, not a whole day or more, that it really requires. And so let me tell you a story that kind of embodies this. So I think that just take departing some sort of uncontrolled airport that's in rising terrain, blah, 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 right? And you got the Part 91 guy. We're kind of doing it based on if you're going to fly a SID or an obstacle departure procedure, and hopefully you know where to look and the weather and if you can see and avoid and all that stuff. And then you have 135 guys that, certain companies have different procedures on how you depart or arrive these airports, et cetera. And then you have the airlines where it's really spelled out for you, I think. But I'm sitting there in Montrose one day, and there's a ceiling. It wasn't low. It's probably 5,000 feet overcast or whatever it was, 4,000 feet, something like that. And I heard the major airliner, Airbus, take off, making his radio calls and the whole thing, and blasts off. And I hear him on center, and they're like, sir, you need to turn to it. And they gave him a heading. You're heading right towards mountainous terrain. You can hear the guy read it back, and they're flustered. And you could tell they really didn't know what they were doing, or didn't really have a defined departure plan. And the weather wasn't that bad, but it certainly was obscuring the mountains, and they were heading right into them. And they turned, and I'm sure everything ended up fine. But it's one of those things where you don't have a controller on the ball or something like that. I think that some of the stuff can become life and death at a certain point. And that day I was like, wow, I mean, at all levels, no matter where you're at, it's important to know how to depart, what this stuff means, what these climb gradients mean, what they're based on, what are you required to do by the law, single engine performance and dual engine performance and all of this stuff. And so what we did was we reached out to a guy named Jim Deuvall. Jim Deuvall is the performance expert. He knows this stuff front, back, and sideways. And we had a good talk with him. I learned something. I'm sure you did too, Dylan.
Absolutely. It was a really good conversation we had with him. It is takeoff performance. There's some conceptualization stuff. It's not always easy to follow. Honestly, this interview, take your time with it. Digest it a little piece by piece. There's so much good information in there, and it is really important. And there's no standardization when it's taught, right? It's not like you can expect to go to the simulator every year and you're going to get a standard, explanation from the ground school instructor or the simulator instructor. So the onus, especially if you're a Part 91 or even Part 135 pilot, it's really up to you to be able to understand this. You're responsible to know and understand this, and it's not easy.
And I don't know of a better subject in aviation that you can really get into the weeds on. And I'm going to warn you, this interview, it gets in the weeds a little bit, and we edited it down too to try and keep everyone engaged. But it's one of those things that's worth your time. Stay engaged, maybe do some other research, listen to it again. I don't know. There's some really good information in there. And I think our hope is that if everybody takes at least something away from it that they learned that they didn't really realize, and I think there'll be more than one thing. I certainly learned a few things, but it's an important subject. We're going to continue to talk about it as the show moves forward. Take a listen. Let us know what you think. We're always interested in your comments. Jim Deuvall, everybody. Here we go.
And on the line, we have Mr. Jim Deuvall. He's the founder and CEO of CAVU Companies. It's a 30-year-old company that provides performance software for turbojet and turboprop operators. Currently, he's got customers including flight departments, charter operators around the world, as well as the U.S. military. Jim's got many years of experience as a simulator instructor and a pilot. He frequently lectures at aircraft manufacturer meetings and simulator training centers, often with an emphasis on takeoff performance. Jim, welcome to the 21.5 podcast. Thank you for making time for us today. And we wanted to have a conversation with you about FAA's Info 18014, which came out in December. And we're hoping you could kind of break it down, explain it in layman's terms for us, the pilots who maybe aren't as plugged into the performance scene as you are, and get a little clarity on what exactly the FAA was saying.
Right. And thank you, Dylan and Max, for having me on your show. It's an honor to be here with you guys. The info letter, the 18014 that came out in actually November, I think it was actually.
Oh, okay.
It's not a very long letter. It's only 2.5 pages long, but it basically addresses an issue that a lot of pilots have been very confused about. And there's been a lot of misinformation on the internet about it as well. So basically, the info letter deals with two issues. That is, in the two statements that they make, is that if you are departing on a SID and you can meet the SID, and let's just say merely meet the SID, let's just say you're basically meeting the SID with all engines operating, that does not assure that you're going to meet your Part 135 obstacle clearance. Likewise, the opposite side of that coin is if you meet your 135 obstacle clearance with one engine in op, that does not assure that you will be able to meet the SID with all engines operating. So there's been a tendency in the past that pilots would only do one engine in op obstacle clearance calculations, and then they just assume that they're going to meet the SID. And that was what was being addressed in that letter.
So the FAA is saying basically there's two separate things you need to look at here: all engines operating and one engine operating, and that's via two different things essentially, right?
That's exactly right.
Okay, that's kind of what I got out of it too.
So the confusion comes into the picture when, depending on the methodology that people use to calculate their one engine in op obstacle clearance, they are quite honestly setting themselves up to not meet the all-engine operating climb gradients.
Can you explain that a little bit further? How? I mean, just give us kind of an example, I guess, of how that would work.
Right. So if you were to take your obstacle clearance and basically calculate a departure path, which differed from the TERP's departure procedure, and this is just an obvious one. Let's say the departure procedure is turning left and you're turning right, and you do all of your calculations based upon turning right, then obviously you're making no assurance, A, for meeting the obstacle clearance, one engine or all engine operating going to the left on your normal departure procedure. So that's really obvious one. But if you're using something like a runway analysis approach, where you may actually be following the departure procedure, may not be a special procedure, may just be following one that's underlying the normal departure procedure for TERPs, but it's not following a gradient, okay? Little background information. So when you have a departure procedure and you see it published on the departure plate that says it's 400 feet per nautical mile up to 4,000 feet, that's your all-engine operating climb requirement. That is meeting both obstacle clearance and meeting ATC requirements. So that SID has built into it a safety margin, which increases depending upon how steep the climb gradient is. And we'll get into that a little bit later if you'd like. But essentially, there's a big safety margin built into that. Underneath that safety margin is what we call the obstacle identification surface. This is what was surveyed when they went and built the departure procedure. They actually went out there and they calculated where all the trees, the mountains, the terrain, antennas, all that type of thing are on the departure path. And they basically lay on top of that a gradient or a plane underneath which are all the obstacles. Above that, there are no obstacles, with one caveat. There are, and we'll address that in a moment, and that has to deal with close-in obstacles. So if you can meet the all-engine operating gradient, which is the 400 feet per nautical mile, you are clearing all of the obstacles, but you may not, in fact, be clearing the obstacles to 135 standards. The 135 standards say that you have to be able to clear all obstacles by 35 feet on a net path. So your all-engine operating gradient, which is what you're trying to do when you depart out of an airport and you have the 400 feet per nautical mile to 4,000 feet, that's based on a gross gradient, not a net gradient. That's actually where the aluminum of the airplane is. The requirements for 135 is that you have to clear all obstacles by 35 feet on the net gradient, and those are the numbers that are in your AFM. Does that make more sense, or is that...
No, that makes sense. All of this stuff is super complicated, and I think that's why you find very few people that are actually verifying that they're meeting the letter of the law that that's required on these departures. So then they publish a DP, which will then have written a minimum climb gradient, which is a gross gradient, and if you're 135, you have to meet the minimum net climb gradient, which would be 35 feet above that. Correct?
Correct. Yes. So for your 135 operators, now 91 you can do whatever you want, but 135 operators or 121 operators have to be able, this is regulatory, they have to be able to clear all obstacles by 35 feet either above it or 300 feet lateral to it.
Okay.
That's the requirement. All
right. So while we're on the two engine side of this puzzle here, what's the other funny thing, I think, that is that the FAA doesn't require Part 25 certificated airplanes, the manufacturers, to publish all engine operating climb data. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. In fact, there are very few. I'm trying to think of one on the top of my head that actually has that data. It's usually at the request of the operator, and it has to be a big operator to get this data from the manufacturer, but I don't see it normally published because it's not part of the requirement for 125.
So the manufacturers have the data, they just don't necessarily publish it? Is that what you're saying?
That's correct.
Is that a liability thing? They figure why publish more than they're required to because it could just potentially get them in trouble?
Yeah, exactly.
So then the info letter kind of says, okay, so we realize that while we're asking you to ensure that you meet these all engines operating climb gradients, but there's no data to verify that, then they put it back in your lap as the pilot, right? You should know your airplane, convert that gradient based on your speed to a climb rate, and then you should know what your airplane will do to meet or exceed that rate. Is that what they're saying?
Right. And basically what they're saying in the info letter, I guess the best you can do without any other data is to know what your climb rate is based, the feet per minute number is for your aircraft. And what I advise people to do is to go look in their flight planning manual. It's sometime in a different section than the AFM, maybe in the AOM, the operating manual, or the flight planning manual, and look for your time to climb charts if they even offer them.
Oh, that's a good idea.
And then look for the worst scenario. Go to 10,000 feet, go to 40 degrees Celsius, and a tailwind. And they'll have a climb feet per minute number there listed for you.
Okay.
And if you take that number, that's your red flag number. If you calculate on your particular departure on a particular day out of a particular airport that your climb, the required climb rate, not climb gradient, but climb rate is above that number, then you need to do more calculations. If it's below that number, you're probably good to go.
That's good advice, because at least you have a leg to stand on then. It should someone try and contest that you did or did not evaluate this, at least you're using something that's from the manufacturer than just kind of swagging it as a pilot. But
yeah, exactly.
So now I'm more curious about this all engine operating data. So are you, as the third party performance provider, are you able to get that data from the manufacturers, and that's where you are able to provide that information?
No, we actually work from an assumption. Here's the assumption that we operate from. We're very different than runway analysis. We use the departure procedure path precisely, and we are meeting your net gradient to the obstacle identification surface. So let me put it this way. The departure procedure, as I said, is built on top of this obstacle identification surface. They're married together. They're connected, if you will. It's a mathematical formula to get one from the other. If you're using runway analysis, you're not trying to meet that gradient. So you're in a sense disconnected from the departure procedure's gradient.
Okay.
You're just clearing particular obstacles here and there until you get to a holding pattern somewhere and then can climb. So you're really disconnected from that whole departure procedure, even if you're maintaining the same path.
So, and let me interrupt you real quick. So the runway analysis is only avoiding close-in obstacles?
It's theoretically clearing known obstacles, but it's doing them just in time. So it's not creating a gradient that it's trying to meet. It's just saying there's an obstacle that's X number of feet down range, and it's so many feet high, and we're going to clear that obstacle by 35 feet.
I see.
That's what they're trying to do. In so doing, theoretically, you can take off with a heavier weight. Now, when you add close-in obstacles to the equation, which they added with the new TERPs, that is no longer a valid presupposition that you can take off with a higher weight. There's many times that our calculations will show a higher weight than runway analysis because of the way they interpret close-in obstacles. But that might be a different discussion for a different day.
So to summarize, on your runway analysis, that is not necessarily, if those paths diverge from the departure that you filed, the runway analysis is not necessarily looking at that departure.
Well, it's not meeting either the SID gradient or the OIS, the obstacle identification surface. It's not trying to meet that. It's just trying to get over known obstacles.
Right.
And so what legal requirement are you meeting at that point? Anything?
Well, you're just meeting the 135 requirement to clear the obstacle by 35 feet or 300 feet laterally. Yeah.
Okay.
Our program basically keeps the entire net takeoff path above that obstacle identification surface. Now, there's a couple of benefits to that. Number one, training. You don't have to specially train for every procedure, and literally you have to do that when you're doing runway analysis. Every procedure is different, and you have to, and even at the same airport, different runways, every special procedure is very, very different. And the footnotes or the little small print of each departure will have some gotchas in there if you're not careful. Like it might require you to use a 25-degree bank angle, or not to perform the level off and acceleration at the acceleration height, to just bypass that. And there's a number of little notes that they use to technically fit their path into their paradigm. So you have to be careful about that. When you're using our product, you're always going to fly your V1 cut engine out procedure. You're going to fly to, you're going to rotate it at VR. You're going to go to feed 2. You're going to maintain the airplane's configuration until you get to whatever the level off height is. Some of them are mandatory 400 feet. Some of them vary between 400 feet and 1,500 feet. Some of you have extended second segments where they go up higher than that. But normally it's run between 400 feet and 1,500 feet, at which time you must level off, accelerate, clean up the wing, and then bring your power back to max continuous and then continue your climb. That's the net takeoff profile that's described in the AFM and is required that you use to meet your 135 obstacle clearance requirements.
That makes sense. And I think the first point that you made is something that Max and I have discussed on our own, which is I'm a huge fan of having one intended departure path and not diverging, as a backup plan. Yeah. What happens? I think you just have one, even if you're using runway analysis, my argument was always, well, if you're going to use a runway analysis, figure out what that plan is and just file that and try and make that work so that there is no question about what you're flying. And obviously that's not always possible to do. I think just having one intended flight path is the way to go.
It's so much more realistic than, and we've talked about, having the filed, standard SID or whatever on the left FMS and unlinking them and then having the other departure procedure on the right FMS. And, but you're trying to complicate an already complicated situation that I think is unrealistic unless you practice that particular DP and runway analysis procedure in the sim at that airport and are really familiar with it or something. But otherwise, you're just kind of setting yourself up to fail. So your program, I guess we kind of looked at the all engines operating portion of this, and then let's go back to the info letter. So then the second half of that is to say, okay, now there's a one engine operating requirement. And can you just kind of explain that?
Yeah. And actually, we didn't actually finish the discussion about how we determine that you meet the all engine operating part of that requirement with the EFB Pro. So if I may just take a moment to finish that thought.
Sure.
If you think about it, and this takes a little bit of a mental picture, the SID is essentially just if you take your hands and you put them together like you're praying, and you leave your right hand stationary, that would be the obstacle identification surface. And if you move your left hand like an alligator, that becomes the SID. That the space between those two is essentially just a mathematical number. And it's very close, actually, to, under most circumstances, to the same amount that they degrade the performance to go from gross numbers to the net numbers that are in the AFM. So what we're saying is if we keep the net takeoff profile above that right hand, that line, that obstacle identification surface, the entire way, that the actual airplane, even with one engine in operative, is going to, the actual airplane, not the net path, but the actual airplane is going to be very close to the actual SID. It's going to be underneath it, but it's going to be very close to it. If you add in your second engine, you are going to blast through the SID requirement with all engines operating. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I see what you're saying. So whereas the info letter kind of splits the two into two different things, you essentially are looking at, I hesitate to say the aggregate of it, but a path that will meet the requirement for both the SID as well as the close-in obstacles. And then you guys know that in the worst case, you're still above that. And then all engine operating, you're well above it. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. So we're just saying that if you use our program or our methodology, not necessarily our program, our methodology, that if you take off with the weight restriction for the one engine in up, and you've met that requirement for 135, because we're using an obstacle gradient that is intimately connected to the departure procedure gradient, that with all engines operating, you will by default meet that as well.
Right. Well, I didn't realize it was actually a complete separate methodology. Kind of what I gathered when I read the info, and then, there was the runway analysis response, and then your response was that you were just saying, look, we provide all engine operating data as well, but really now I understand it's a different methodology taking into account both simultaneously, and then, comparing that to what kind of performance you can get out of your airplane for that day.
Right. And if you marry that with the example I said before about knowing your feet per minute number, it's I've done it in the simulator. I've never found a problem where I couldn't meet the all engine operating SID. Now, there are airplanes that can't meet the all-engine operating SID when it's hot and heavy and high. I have seen airplanes that do that, but correspondingly, you will reduce your one engine and up requirement or weight as well. And when you reduce your weight per the 135 requirement, then that weight with all engines operating clearly bypasses the SID requirement.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that the general perception, if you took most operators out there and asked, if you did a survey and asked them when you depart, what are your, what requirements do you need to meet? I think most people would look at the SID or the obstacle departure procedure. If there's a published climb gradient, they would say we have to meet that single engine. Is that kind of would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I think a lot of people just assume that they can meet it, and most jets can, to be honest with you. In the examples when pilots or when airplanes aren't meeting the SID, the climb via SID part, and the controllers are starting to see a lot of airplanes not meeting it. They're just gonna vary their departure procedure protocol for that day or whatever. But it is the responsibility of the pilot to be able to, especially if you got an airplane that's not a big performer, to be able to meet that climb restriction. And it's not they started to take the climb gradients off the SIDs. I think they did it because they thought they were decluttering the paperwork a little bit. Essentially, what you have now is the most restrictive part of the climb gradient, and it's usually right up front. 500 feet per nautical mile up to 1,000 feet or 1,500 feet. What's after that is 200 feet per nautical mile, according to the way the AIM is written.
Right.
So if you can meet the first part of it, you're going to meet the second part of it as well. But there are SIDs out there, and I'm thinking of one down in like Dallas Love or something like that. That actually has within probably 24 miles, you have to be at 10,000 feet to kind of keep you down lower. And then they have this above 10,000 foot restriction on the SID. So there are ones that could pose a problem, but again, you just need to know what that magical number is for it to be a flag to you to figure it out. And then if you don't think you're going to be able to meet it, to just advise ATC accordingly.
But I think what the info letter was saying is a lot of people were holding themselves to single engine performance to meet the climb gradient, which is hugely restrictive. And they're saying that's not what we're asking you to do.
If you're 135, that would be a restriction. You would have to, whether it had any impact on the SID or not. What the letter is saying is we don't want you to have to meet the all-engine operating gradient, the 400 feet per nautical mile up to 4,000 with one engine in op. They're saying don't do that. That would be very restrictive. We don't do that, obviously. We're looking at the obstacle identification gradient that's underneath that 400 feet per nautical mile, and you're clearing that because that's where all the obstacles are. So yeah. So what pilots were doing was going into the FM and saying, well, I got 400 feet per nautical mile, and that translates to a 5 point whatever gradient, and then look it up in the AFM and say, here's our weight restriction, which in itself is not the proper way to do the calculation, but that's what a lot of pilots do.
Right. And that's what I think that this letter was issued to clarify exactly that, because that's what was happening, right?
Well, I think that the letter actually came about because there's a lot of people using runway analysis, and you can meet the runway analysis 135, and you can be, let's just say that runway analysis did what it was supposed to do and allowed you to take off at max gross weight out of a particular airport. But on that particular day, at max gross weight, you would not be able to meet the all-engine operating SID, because it's the all-out engine operating SID might be a different path, and it might be over different terrain. So, whereas the runway analysis is just taking you down maybe a valley to a point where you can hold and then circle. Completely different operation. So
got it.
That's what that's what that letter was trying to say. If you're going to, just because you can meet your 135 requirement, i.e. runway analysis, that does not mean that you're going to meet your all engine operating SID requirement. And they specifically say it's up to the pilot to do the math and figure out whether or not you can meet the all engine operating.
But with your system, you don't have to do that because it's taking into account.
Correct.
Okay. So I guess that kind of sums up the different terms and data and how to comply and what the info letter was saying. But so after they issued that letter, I guess there was some industry response that I think started there on the MBAA airmail discussion. Is that you were involved in, right, Jim?
Right. There are people who are just as adamant about using runway analysis applications as I am in, promoting EFB Pro, obviously.
Sure.
But there is a tendency for people that have that presupposition that runway analysis is the best thing since sliced bread, that they tend to read these type of info letters with that mindset in mind. And they kind of start reading into the language. And if you look back at some of the airmail correspondence there, they have a tendency to start saying things that are just not true. Like, you can't use a departure procedure in any way, shape, or form to comply with your one engine and up climb requirements. And therefore, you must use runway analysis. It's simply a false statement. If you can meet your close-in obstacle requirements and you can meet the obstacle identification surface on a net path, you've met all the requirements of 135, and it all came out of that all-engine operating TERPs. But you have to be able to meet your close-in obstacles because close-in obstacles are not incorporated in the TERPs climb gradient.
So typical of any industry, right? The government comes out with a position and everybody kind of says, yes, see, that validates us, right? It's like kind of how it works.
Exactly. Yeah. And you try to gently respond to that and say, well, you're kind of overreading this a little bit. Whenever you read something from the government, it means exactly what it says and nothing more.
So I read a couple of things online, just from the online message boards and social media and stuff like that. I'm going to read a couple of different statements from people, and sure, you tell me if you buy or sell these positions. All right.
Okay.
All right. One poster says, when it comes to these are people trying to simplify this. There's a lot of this discussion online. Obviously pilots, you've been around pilots long enough to know we want things as simple and it's dumbed down as possible. So one poster says, when it comes to any required climb requirement on the SID, 10-9 page or missed approach procedure, you only have to ask yourself one question. Am I flying an airplane with at least 2 turbine engines or not? If the answer is that you are, then your airplane can make any required climb requirement as long as all engines are operating, and so you meet the requirements. If you're flying a 172, it's time to start calculating expected climb rate versus ground speed, because that's really who the FAA is talking to about climb requirements. If one of the turbine engine quits, you have to have a plan, and since I'm not an engineer, I pay engineers to give me a plan, which they refer to as runway analysis. So the EIO, I think that's engine inoperative spaghetti charts in the AFM are irrelevant, and all the climb and visibility requirements listed on the 10-9 pages in SIDS are irrelevant. Do you buy or sell that?
Yeah, well, there's a number of fallacies with that statement. The whole conversation here is for turbine jets and turboprops.
Right.
The info letter that's what it's for, and it's untrue that every airplane can meet all SID gradients under all circumstances. It's again not true. If that were true, the FAA wouldn't have released the info letter. The last part there about the one engine in-op numbers in the manual are, how did that
irrelevant?
Irrelevant, yeah. The AFM is the only. I mean, any number that you have available to you regarding performance is essentially going to be a one engine in-op number. The entire AFM is filled with one engine in-op numbers except for the landing data. That's just a strange comment.
Yeah, I read that. I thought, oh, okay, I'll bring that to Jim. Okay, somebody else said, and I think this might be a little bit more to the point. It says they were trying to summarize this, and they said the intent of this info and notice is to clarify that even if your aircraft can meet the published IFR climb gradient with one engine inoperative, you may still not have adequate OEI obstacle clearance due to the fact that the published gradient does not account for low close-in obstacles. The segmented nature of an OEI climb and the fact that the OEI climb data may not be extrapolated above its maximum height, which is typically 1,500 feet above field elevation. Do you buy or sell that?
Yeah, I mean, except for that last add-on statement there about the maximum altitude there, that's not correct. But yeah, that's right. The all-engine operating gradient of TERPs does not, ever since change 19 that happened in 2002, they do not take into account close-in obstacles.
Okay. I think a lot of pilots in general struggle to keep up on this. And there are a variety of resources available. There's also a variety of bad information out there, which I think we've kind of covered. And I think, obviously, what you learn in training at the simulator centers and stuff like that can also, they're not all singing from the same sheet of music. So what are your thoughts on, one, the training centers and what they're teaching? And then two, what do you think is the best way for the average line pilot to stay up on this information and remain proficient?
When I was an instructor, I would spend, 40 minutes out of a class going through what people did for obstacle clearance or performance calculations. And then I would spend the rest of the class basically showing them why what they're doing was going to not work out as well as they think it's going to work out. I ended up writing a book on the subject called Aircraft Performance Myths and Methods, which go over all of those different ways that pilots did performance and were wrong. Not much has changed in all of those years since I wrote that book. Most of the time that I talk to pilots in groups or flight departments, I still get myth number 1, myth number 2, myth number 3 thrown at me all the time, that's how they do performance. So not a lot of advancement there. In the simulator training centers, and not all instructors, but I have noticed there is I don't know if orchestrated is the right word, but there's certainly a movement towards relying upon the FMS to do your obstacle clearance calculations. There is, if you want to see a detailed description of this on our website, there's a section called Pilot Points. There's a white paper there called the Toluca 6 Departure, dealing with the Challenger 605. It's a pretty well publicized event that one of our customers had gone to training class at a very popular 142 sim school, and they were teaching this particular departure in a Challenger 605. Our customer happened to be the FAA lead for the 605, and he was using our calculator during the class, and we were showing that it was 4,000 pounds less than what they were showing in the class. And he told me that they went to all the other instructors, and he verified that it was the number that they were saying was 39,000 pounds, and we were saying 35,000 pounds. They went into the simulator, they put in the numbers in the FMS, and it came out to 39,000 pounds. He sent me all the paperwork, and I sent back to him the actual how you do this calculation in the manual. And I showed that they were using the wrong charts. They missed the chart completely. And this is the big fallacy of the FMS. It does not know a net takeoff path from, a hole in the ground. It doesn't calculate that. FMSs basically don't calculate anything. They basically look up tables. FMSs are not a good substitute for obstacle clearance. It knows nothing about the net takeoff profile. It knows nothing about the acceleration heights. Even if you buy the performance packages that come with some of these FMSs, they still will give a wrong number. As a result of this letter that's on my website, this white paper that we wrote, Bombardier actually turned out an alert letter to all their operators saying not to use the FMS for obstacle clearance calculations. It does not do that. One of the things I'm going to tell people right up front, do not rely upon your FMS for the obstacle clearance calculations. It does not do that calculation. It doesn't know anything about close-in obstacles or anything of the sort. So I have been noticing there is this movement in a lot of training centers, and perhaps it's because they're so tied for time. I don't know. We had a little more flexibility when I was instructor, how much time we took. So there seems to be a movement away from actually teaching performance, real performance. I talked to a lot of Hawker pilots, and very few guys know how to do value of D calculations. They don't even know really what it means. So that's a little disconcerting. I hope it's not all centers, but I have noticed it.
I think you're right. I just went through initial training and the performance portion of it was very brief, to say the least. And so I would venture to say that's because a lot of people, including the instructors, don't actually understand how all this works. And it's super complicated. And that's why it's so misunderstood and nobody really knows exactly what they're supposed to be doing here and everything else. And so let's take the Part 91 guy like Dylan and I. Our only requirement is to go to that training center every year and do recurrent. But to really stay up on this stuff and understand, it's going to take a little bit more effort than that. Hopefully listening to this podcast will accomplish that. Some reading on the internet, some of the stuff that like Dylan was reading on the forums is good information sometimes, and sometimes it's not good information. I also have listened to some of the audio files and podcasts that you have posted on your website under the pilot points that are pretty good at explaining this stuff. You are going to have to listen to it a couple times because it's a lot of information. But yeah, I mean, there's any other resources out there, Jim, that you recommend or advise for people to really wrap their heads around this whole airplane performance situation?
Right. Well, the FAA has a couple of videos out that are actually pretty darn good. They're underwritten by a runway analysis company, so there is a little slant there. Kind of keep that in mind. Some of the runway analysis companies have some videos out which are not bad. In fact, they have one out that actually addresses that FMS issue that I just addressed. As you said, on our website, we have I have an hour and a half seminar that goes over all of TERPs, how the old TERPs, the new TERPs. So the old TERPs would be like the international TERPs, international departure procedures, and our new TERPs. I go over all of that. I show graphs and kind of give you an idea. But yeah, this is and one other thing that I notice in the training centers is I think a lot of pilots, because they are confused by this issue, that they just kind of throw up their hands and say, I'm going to let somebody else do it for me, i.e. runway analysis. Well, that's a real slippery slope. And in my own personal experience, it takes pilots 3 attempts at a departure procedure using runway analysis to get it down correct. And if you take them to another runway at the same airport, it takes them another 3 attempts. And if you bring them back 6 months later, you have to start the process all over again. Runway analysis is a highly specialized procedure. It was never intended to be used ad hoc at every airport that you go to. It's designed for a very specific purpose. And even on top of that, they're not flight tested procedures. They're mathematical models. So you have to actually prove that they work. The Gulfstream did a study, I don't know, 4 years ago maybe, where they actually put their own demo pilots in a simulator, 550 simulator, and ran them through runway analysis procedures. And they found that on a number of procedures, not all of them, but on a number of them, they could not meet the departure procedure in a Gulfstream 550, which is not a slouch of an airplane. And so they ended up having to tell their clientele that they could not recommend using that because their own test pilots couldn't fly the procedures. So right in the advisory circular that talks about runway analysis, 120-91, it says explicitly that it's up to the operator to prove that the procedure is operational for their aircraft that they fly. It's up to them. So keep that in mind. There's a whole host of things that have to be taken into consideration. And I find at some simulator training centers that they just kind of say, well, you guys are using this, so go ahead and do that.
So there's a lot of rope out there to hang yourself with, sounds like.
Yeah, there really is. And particularly a lot of the, younger pilots that, I'm a kind of an old school guy. There was an old video put out by the Children of the Magenta Line. It's on YouTube. You can go watch it.
I've seen, yeah, we've both seen it.
Yeah, he's a captain or a performance engineer like myself. I'm not sure exactly what his background was, but he talks about a lot of this stuff, and it's a heavy reliance on somebody doing the work for you. Our philosophy is always, we want you to understand what it is that you're doing, and we want you to be involved in the process. We want you to put in that it's 400 feet per nautical mile so that you actually look at it on the chart and see that that's what you need, the gradient you have to meet with all engines operating. And from that, we will call what your numbers need to be for one engine and up. So there are resources out there. You're probably not going to get it at training centers anymore. It's going to be up to you to go do it yourself. I try to provide some resources. It's all free on my website. If you want to buy the book, there's a cost to that. I certainly try to provide it and have been for a number of years. So,
great. Okay. Just to kind of wrap things up, Jim, and I think you've kind of driven your points home, but is there any final message, or if there's one thing that the pilots listening to this episode today, if there's one thing they could take away from this episode, what would you say that is in just a few, a couple sentences?
Look, you're the captain. You have a fiduciary responsibility to your passengers and the company you work for, to your wife, your significant other, to fly the airplane safely. There are procedures in place for obstacle clearance and so on. You need to know what that is. The FAA is good at that, but it also, like you said, it'll give you a rope to hang yourself if you're not careful. It's up to you to know how these things work and to fly the airplane accordingly. And to not do so, or to abdicate that fiduciary responsibility to someone else is not a good path. I don't think it's not a good way to go.
Oh, that's well said, Jim. Thanks. If people want to get more information about your product and the website you were referring, where can they find that?
It's www.CAVU Companies, COMPANIES.com.
Great. And your contact info is on that website?
Yes, it is. And we also have an 800 number that's 800-464-3375. Be glad to talk to anybody that wants to talk to me.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Jim, for your time and your expertise. We really appreciate it. Hopefully we've shed some light here on the murky subject of airplane performance, takeoff performance in particular. So,
yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah. Thanks again, Jim. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye. You had said you had a good story. It wasn't about you, but another buddy that you knew at your charter company. You got to tell us that one too.
Well, we all swap stories, I mean, we ended up inevitably in Teterboro or Van Nuys and have the little pilot roundtables with beers flowing. And anyway, all of us would have numerous things go on throughout a given week. But the two guys I was talking to had just flown a younger billionaire dude, and they flew him to somewhere on the East Coast, and he had an attorney with him. And when they got to this little small Hodunk airport or whatever, wherever they were, they had said that they were going to run in the FBO and only be in there about 30 minutes for a quick meeting, and then they were going to bounce and head up to Washington. So anyway, the pilots were essentially just supposed to hang out on board.
Yeah. Well,
they come back out a few minutes later and they said that the FBO is not private enough, so we're going to have this meeting on board. And just about that time, this just perfect 10 walks out.
Okay.
She's a model, and anyway, she comes out, gets on board, and the pilots are just hanging out and they can hear every word. And the billionaire dude had reached a point where in the public's eye, it would have been necessary for him to settle down. I don't know at what age he was, but anyway, they had, done some research and determined that this might be the perfect gal for him. And they were going to kind of try to arrange something. So they listened to them kind of hammer out the details with this marriage. And it was, the numbers that were thrown out were like, if you stick with me for this long, it'll be, whatever, 10 million. If you stick around for, this long, it'll be 15 million.
No way.
If there's a kid involved, that goes up $1 million a year, plus $1 million for every, year the kid's alive or whatever. And, anyway, it was, they said it was just unbelievable. Like, what was going on. They're like, I can't believe we're bearing witness to this. So
they were just up in the cockpit while they were doing this negotiation.
Yeah, absolutely, dude. That's Charter 101, man.
Oh my God.
Anyway, so they figure it all out and they sign the paperwork and they
on the plane.
They pop some bottle and then it becomes like, how are we going to sell your family on this? And then what they decide they were going to do is go pick up her mom and sister at some point, and they were going to go on some epic shopping spree in New York, and that was going to be like the, hey, I'm going to try to make him like my new guy type thing. And
oh my God.
Anyway, so they mentioned after they've talked about this, they've talked about does she want to go with them up to Dulles, or excuse me, up to Washington for their next deal or whatever? And she goes, yeah. So anyway, they take off and head towards Dulles with this chick, and they go consummate the marriage in the back.
No way.
Yeah. So
with the lawyer on board?
With the lawyer just hanging out. By the way, the lab on a Citation isn't huge, so I give them props for however.
Jeez. Well, you know what we say at this show, flexibility is the key to air power. That's our motto here, so.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening with us. Do you have an idea for a segment or a great story to tell? Email us at info@215podcast.com. Check us out on the web at www.215podcast.com and on social media at 215podcast. And remember, 215 Podcast is always spelled 21FIVE podcast.
If you like our show, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. It really helps to grow our show. New episodes will be taking flight every couple of weeks. Until then, remember, flexibility is the key to air power.